Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we take specialized research, sometimes spanning centuries, and distill it into the essential knowledge and surprising insights you need to be instantly well-informed.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most exciting and tumultuous periods in economic history, the birth and astonishing rise of indigenous capitalism in 19th century Western India.
And this wasn't just about trade, was it? This was a high-stakes economic adventure.
Oh, absolutely. It's set against this incredible backdrop of Mughal decline, Maratha expansion, and of course, British ascension.
That's right. And we're tracking this story through the lives of three, absolute giants from Bombay: Chirwadi Arjunji Nathji, Jamsetji Jijibhoy, and Premchand Royshan.
These men weren't just participating in history. You could argue they were defining the rules of modern Indian commerce as it was happening.
And the sources we're digging into today really emphasize that this was an era of just rapid, unforeseen change where global and local economies were colliding.
And these figures weren't merely lucky. They were masters of navigating volatility. The research is very clear on this. They succeeded because they were willing to think big and take risks.
In ways their predecessors never had to.
In ways they never had to, exactly. It was a completely new world.
So our mission today is really to get into the mechanics of their success and also their failures. We want to extract those core insights and surprising stories that cemented this as a proud milestone in the history of indigenous capitalism in India.
We're giving you a shortcut to understanding this crucial economic trajectory.
How to forge alliances, how to institutionalize charity, and occasionally how far you can bend the rule of law without breaking your own reputation.
And what's so fascinating is that this commercial spirit was flourishing in such an unlikely setting. I mean, a small island that was gifted away as a dowry. We're going far beyond just ledger books here. This is a story of adventure and incredible resilience.
Okay, so if we look at all the material we have, what's the core question we're answering for you today?
I think it's really two interconnected questions. First, how did these merchants, who were deeply rooted in traditional indigenous ways of doing business?
You mean relying on things like trust, family networks, age-old credit systems?
Exactly, all of that.
Yeah.
How did they manage to adapt and exploit the massive new opportunities that came with European domination?
Okay. And the second question?
And second, and this is maybe the most revealing part, what does their success tell us about the indispensable importance of good governance, legal stability, and modern infrastructure for capital to truly form and flourish?
Right. Let's unpack this by setting the scene first, because it involves this epic geographical shift. We can't really talk about the rise of Bombay without first acknowledging the tragic decline of its great predecessor, Surat.
Surat. It was famously known as Bandar Mubarak, the Blessed Port, and it truly was the jewel in the crown of Mughal commerce through the 16th and 17th centuries.
The Mughals provided the perfect conditions, didn't they?
They provided the three essentials for international trade to thrive. First, you had physical stability, so reasonably good roads and security for transport across these vast distances.
Which is not a small thing.
Not at all. Second, a functional currency system. Now, it had its quirks. You often had to exchange coins at a loss when a new emperor came to the throne, but on the whole, it was stable and reliable.
And the third essential.
And third, and maybe most important, was an environment that was conducive to capital accumulation. In other words, the protection of private property.
And the scale of that trade was just incredible. By the turn of the 18th century, India, largely powered by ports like Surat, controlled a quarter of the world's entire textile trade.
It was a global shipping and financing hub, a true metropolis. But here's the danger, the inherent weakness. That whole golden age was completely contingent on continued political stability.
A house of cards built on centralized power.
It was. And when Aurangzeb died in 1707, that centralized Mughal authority entered a long, drawn-out, and ultimately fatal erosion.
And Surat was right in the firing line.
Surat entered a period of profound insecurity. Suddenly, merchants were constantly faced with war, weakened local governance, and perhaps most critically, the complete breakdown of the upcountry supply channels.
Wait, unpack that for us. Why was the disruption of those supply channels so fatal to Surat's economy?
Well, because Surat wasn't just a port. It was the outlet for products manufactured deep within the subcontinent. You had textiles from Gujarat, silk from Bengal, and later opium from Malwa.
So the port itself produced nothing. It was a
It
funnel.
was a funnel, exactly.
Yeah.
And when the roads became unsafe because of regional conflicts, when tax collectors basically became highwaymen, when the supply routes were constantly being interrupted by Maratha raids,
Yeah.
the goods stopped flowing.
And if the goods stop flowing.
The ships stopped coming. And if the ships stopped coming, the sophisticated financial engine of the entire port just seized up.
And the Boston trading communities, those dominant Hindu and Jain groups, they would have been hyper aware of this instability.
Their entire existence rested on credit. They prized something called a brew, which is a mix of creditworthiness and honor above everything else. And for a brew to function, you need reliable security and a working legal system to guarantee transactions.
It's all about trust.
It's all about trust. So, faced with this growing insecurity and the rising, often aggressive dominance of English private traders, the Banayas started a very deliberate, calculated migration into Bombay.
And the sources give a vivid example of the final straw for many of them.
The 1795 riots in Surat. Muslim rioters targeted property, and the most devastating loss wasn't just physical inventory.
It was the accounting records.
Exactly. The Banaya Mahajan, their powerful trade body, petitioned the company for protection after rioters destroyed Ashraf's accounts.
And why was that so catastrophic?
Because these communities ran entirely on trust and their personal books, large deposits were often made without any receipts. Everything relied purely on the Ashraf's word and his meticulous records.
So destroying the accounts meant a complete systemic collapse of commercial trust.
You've got it. It was an economic apocalypse for them.
So Bombay didn't just offer physical safety from bandits or riots. It offered a promise of restored creditworthiness through a reliable external system.
That was the promise.
But let's step back for a second. What did this small, initially dreary settlement, which Charles II had received as dowry in 1661, actually have that Surat had lost?
It offered several unique structural advantages that were engineered by the British. First, a magnificent natural harbor-deep, sheltered water, easily defensible.
That's the geography.
Then the practical security. A vigorous naval police, the Bombay Marine, which was highly effective at safeguarding commercial vessels from the pirates that plagued the western coast.
Okay, so physical security was a big part of it. But the research suggests that the true magnetic pull, the thing that mobile capital really responded to, wasn't the harbor or the ships. It was the rule of law.
That is the essential insight. Bombay had the mayor's court, which, unlike the erratic local courts in Surat, was designed to enforce commercial contracts impartially between merchants of all races and religions. This was revolutionary.
Especially for the Banya community, I imagine.
Especially for them. And this brings us to that crucial difference in legal philosophy. This really changed the risk calculus for entrepreneurs.
Tell us more about that. The shift from traditional norms to the British system.
Well, traditional Indian commercial law operated under the principle of joint family liability. So if you, as an entrepreneur, failed to pay a debt, that liability extended to your sons, your grandsons.
Across your entire joint family for generations.
For generations. This was a system that valued the honor of the entire lineage above the individual.
Which creates an enormous systemic risk for anyone who wants to try something radically new or big.
Absolutely. If you were truly ambitious and took a major risk that failed, you could potentially ruin your family for a century.
But Bombay was different.
Bombay adopted the British conception of individual legal responsibility. A person's financial liability was limited essentially to their own lifetime.
Wow.
And that single change drastically reduced the systemic risk for adventurous merchants. It made it exponentially more appealing to invest large sums of money in speculative ventures.
That's a fundamental economic driver right there. Reduce the consequence of failure, and you incentivize innovation. And this commitment to universal justice wasn't an accident, was it?
Not at all. Sir Gerald Ongier, the governor, laid down the mandate way back in 1672. His instructions to the first judge were foundational.
What did he say?
He advised them to look upon all inhabitants, English, Portuguese, and other Christians, Moors, and Gentoo, with one single eye, without distinction of nation or religion.
Ensuring justice even for the meanest person of the island.
It was a formal, stated commitment that private property and commercial dealings would be protected. And that stood in stark contrast to the political atmosphere elsewhere in India.
Right. Unlike Mughal Delhi or even British Calcutta, where the high caste gentry or the colonial Burra Sahib openly disdained the merchant class.
Bombay fostered an environment where trade was explicitly valued and protected. This absence of contempt for the commercial spirit was a powerful, powerful draw.
Okay, so this secure, open, legally enforceable environment created the perfect internal conditions for capital to gather. But the real explosion, the thing that lifted Bombay onto the world stage, required a massive external catalyst.
That catalyst was the late 18th and early 19th century global trade network, which often gets summarized simply as the triangular trade.
It starts with tea, doesn't it?
It starts with the English developing an insatiable growing appetite for Chinese tea. This tea had to be paid for in silver, leading to a massive drain on British imperial reserves.
And the solution. To stop the outflow of silver, the English pushed Indian products into China that the Chinese would have to buy. And that product was opium.
Correct. Bombay became the absolutely critical linchpin in this whole operation, satisfying the English demand for tea by supplying the Chinese demand for Malwa opium and also vast quantities of raw cotton.
And this new immense demand just instantly drove commercialization across Western India on a scale nobody had seen before.
It created this huge internal dynamism. You see Marwari traders and Gujarati Banayas migrating inland to the cash crop areas, specifically Malwa and Gujarat, during the 1820s.
What was their role there?
They were crucial. They acted as the buyers and the financiers for these new cash crops, which led to the rise of entirely new commercial towns and nodes of wealth. And what's more, they conducted these complex remittance operations needed to move this vast new wealth around.
We're talking about the Hundis again, the credit note.
The Hundi network, yes. It wasn't just for moving money for tea and opium. It was indispensable for servicing the military economy during this century of transition.
So armies were being paid through the system.
Constantly. Regional powers, the Marathas, the English company, they all required swift credit transfers to provision troops fighting in all these dispersed theaters of battle. A Shroff in Surat could issue a hundem for payment to a general's army unit operating hundreds of miles away.
These were basically fully functioning, sophisticated global financial instruments.
They were, accepted for transactions in places as remote as China and Russia.
And all of this explosive commercial growth fundamentally changed the demographics of the region.
It did. It attracted the landless masses from the villages to these new urban centers. Job opportunities in the docks, the new industries, the supply caravans. They held an irresistible attraction.
The sources say Bombay's population basically doubled in the first half of the 18th century alone.
It did. And this growth created massive wealth for the merchant class. But importantly, it wasn't a zero-sum game. The sources argue that the rise of the city created widespread employment and opportunity, lifting the economic potential of the entire region.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for our first protagonist, Trivedi Arjunji Nathji. This man operated right in the eye of this transition, successfully navigating the crumbling Mughal system and the emerging British power.
He's the ultimate pragmatic financial giant.
Tell us about him.
Trivedi was a Nagar Brahmin and one of the most powerful Shroffs, the bankers and money changers of Surat. His family firm had a commercial heritage that spanned generations.
And it's critical to understand the power of the Shroffs, right? They weren't just bankers.
Not at all. They financed all the east-west inland trade, running the essential commercial arteries between Bengal and Surat via crucial hubs like Benares. Their hundis were the physical manifestation of the trust and credit that kept the vast Mughal economy liquid.
And Trivedi wasn't just a powerful banker, he was also a political player.
Absolutely. As leaders of the Baniya Mahajan, they didn't just deal with money. They were custodians of commercial law, and they possessed serious political weight, often influencing local governance and administration.
So let's talk about his business portfolio, because it shows just how deeply embedded he was in the local economy before the English even took full control.
His interests were incredibly diverse. He was heavily invested in the region's silk trade with Benares. He managed substantial textile and cotton transactions, and crucially, he served as a senior farmer of customs revenue.
He was a Mokati. What exactly did that mean? How did that give him leverage?
The revenue farming system, or Mokati, meant that Trivedi wasn't just collecting taxes. He was advancing the required revenue to the government up front, often months in advance, and then collecting the customs duties himself, taking on all the risk of collection.
So the government was always in his debt.
Exactly. This gave him two things: immense political influence because the local authorities were constantly indebted to him, and an unparalleled understanding of the flow of goods and capital. He knew exactly what was being traded, by whom, and in what quantity.
And the level of implicit trust he commanded is almost unthinkable today.
It's incredible. The records show he held substantial deposits from local citizens, widows, smaller merchants, even government officials. And the sources confirm these deposits were often made without receipts, relying purely on trust and his books.
His entire enterprise was a testament to the power of his Abreu.
Absolutely. Which made his strategic decision to back the emerging British power, the so-called Anglo-Bania alliance, a monumental, high-stakes move.
The critical moment was the 1759 Castle Revolution.
That's right. The East India Company formally entered Surat's power structure as the Kilidar, or commander of the fort. Trowadi's firm stepped in immediately, providing crucial financial support for the limited military campaign the company undertook.
But the financial support wasn't the hard part, was it? The political maneuvering was the key.
Precisely. To legitimize their control, the company needed the blessing of the distant Mughal authority in Delhi. Trowadi used his established political influence in Delhi to secure the necessary Mughal farman endorsing the new arrangement.
He essentially monetized his political capital to smooth the transition of power to his new patrons.
He did, and this was based entirely on pragmatism, not patriotism.
Right. The analysis is crystal clear on this.
His alliance was based on the conviction that the company had the wherewithal to make good its debt obligations, and that its superior military strength could be relied upon to stabilize the volatile region.
And he got his reward for it.
He was appointed the company's treasurer in Surat.
And this leads to this fascinating dynamic where the company quickly becomes utterly dependent on his established financial network.
The constant warfare during this century of transition required huge, swift credit transfers. The Bombay government, which lacked territory and reliable revenue streams, was almost entirely dependent on local shroffs for funds.
Especially during conflicts like the First Maratha War.
Absolutely. Trowadi's established network that Bengal Banaras Surat wrote was indispensable for provisioning troops in all these dispersed locations.
It's incredible to think that the company, supposedly the dominant power, was essentially being held hostage by its own banker.
That's the reality of it. The company frequently tried to bypass Trowadi to get better interest rates from smaller shroffs, but he was powerful enough to use his influence within the Bani Mahajan to effectively deter smaller firms from agreeing to any proposal.
He maintained his leverage.
Immense leverage, because he was the only one who could reliably move that much money across such a large, unstable territory.
And this concentration of power, both financial and traditional, all culminates in that incredible story, the manslaughter trial of 1800.
It's a perfect case study of colonial law meeting indigenous social power. After a family wedding at Trowadi's huge establishment, jewels were reported missing. Suspicion fell on an old servant named Jairam.
And Trowadi, following local customs, didn't call the new English police.
No, he used his traditional, almost feudal authority. He first summoned a conjurer to divine the thief.
A conjurer?
A conjurer?
Yeah.
And based on the conjurer's findings, Jairam and 2 relatives were accused. Trowadi then ordered his staff to confine and severely flog the suspects over 2 weeks to extract a confession.
And Jairam died under these extreme measures.
He did. On the night of December 9th, the staff escalated the punishment. The records describe about 10 men seizing Jairam, tying a rope fastened to a ceiling beam around his waist, and then placing a large, heavy, grinding stone on his back while he was suspended.
My God.
He died before dawn.
The servant's death immediately transformed this from a private affair of domestic discipline into a public case of capital justice. The court faced an impossible dilemma.
An existential one for the nascent colonial system. Was this a case of murder under English common law, or was it a case of private punishment inflicted by a Brahmin master operating under traditional notions of authority?
He claimed rights over his servants like a father over his son.
He did. And the court had to balance the theoretical ideal of impersonal justice with the profound practical need to keep their absolutely indispensable financier in good humor.
So what was the verdict?
It was a calculated political and legal compromise. Trowadi was acquitted of murder. The court accepted that he never intended to cause Jairam's death, which would have carried the death penalty.
But they found him privy to the illegal punishment.
They did. And crucially, when it came to sentencing, they didn't use English penalties. They imposed traditional scriptural penalties instead.
So it was a masterclass in early colonial accommodation.
It was. It shows the company prioritized buttressing the loyalty of indigenous capital. Trowadi was allowed to be the essential financier of modern war, while simultaneously maintaining his traditional caste-based, almost feudal authority within his own household.
His ability to straddle those two worlds was the source of his continued power.
It was everything.
That's a brilliant distinction. So if Trowadi was the bridge between the old and the new, let's look at Jamsetji Jajiboi, who seems to have embraced the new global order entirely. He set the standard for a truly cosmopolitan merchant prince.
Jamsetji, born in 1783, represents a generation that grew up entirely within this new Bombay ecosystem. He was the son of a weaver from Navsari, but his Parsi community had already laid the foundation for success in Bombay, particularly in shipping.
Right, the Wadia family, the famous Parsi shipwrights. The community was already seen as reliable and adaptable by the early Europeans.
Exactly. So, orphaned young, Jamsetji moves to Bombay, lives with an uncle who was a batliwala, a seller of bottles and perfumes, and he just quickly imbibed the robust, dynamic energy of a city that was poised for this explosive commercial takeoff.
And what was the specific enterprise that launched his immense wealth?
It was the China trade. Jamsetji made the daring decision to join the traffic in raw cotton and then, increasingly, opium.
And opium was, of course, strictly banned by the Chinese government, which made the trade clandestine and highly risky.
Very risky. But the Indian merchants had a distinct competitive edge over the Europeans.
And what was that?
They had two huge advantages. First, superior commercial intelligence. They knew the markets, the demand cycles, the prices far better than European factors, who were often relying on information that was weeks or months out of date.
And second.
They had supply chain knowledge. They knew precisely how to procure the goods, transport them inland, and manage quality control.
And this is where his legendary business relationship with William Jardine begins.
It is. That defining partnership was forged in adversity. Jamsetji suffered a shipwreck off the Cape of Good Hope, and during that rescue and recovery, he bonded with William Jardine, the future head of the powerhouse firm Jardine Matheson.
And this friendship, based on mutual respect and shared risk in a dangerous environment, formed the foundation for this unprecedented business venture.
It did. But his success wasn't just about making the right connections. It was about systematic business acumen.
His execution was meticulous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He didn't rely on a single commodity. His portfolio was heavily diversified across shipping, export, remittances, consignment trade. And if you read his correspondence, it reflects this untiring attention to detail.
He was seen as a benchmark for probity, but also a hard-nosed businessman.
Oh, very much so. There's a great example from 1849, years into their partnership, where Jamsetji wrote explicitly criticizing one of Jardine's transactions for a lack of caution.
So he wasn't just a silent local partner.
Not at all. He was an equal, demanding partner, capable of holding one of the world's most powerful trading companies accountable to his standards of diligence. His integrity, his abrou, was the real foundation of his global success.
But the global economy kept shifting rapidly, and by the 1830s and 40s, two huge structural constraints threatened to sink his entire empire. How did he respond?
The first constraint was political. The East India Company's monopoly on the China trade ended in 1834. Now, this was great for overall free trade, but it immediately dried up Jamsetji's crucial bill of exchange channel.
Can you explain what that bill of exchange channel was doing for him?
Sure. Before 1834, the company had to remit its massive revenues from India back to England. Jamsetji essentially bought the company's bills of exchange in India using the silver he earned from the opium trade in China. The company would then pay him in sterling in London.
So it was a guaranteed, safe, and efficient way to repatriate his China profits to the West.
Exactly. When the monopoly ended, that reliable remittance channel just evaporated overnight.
And the second challenge was technological.
Steamships. Around 1840, they arrive on the scene. Jamsetji owned a vast fleet of traditionally built country craft. These are wind-powered vessels that were reliable but slow and required massive, expensive crews,
And the steamships were faster, cheaper to run, and standardized.
instantly rendering his entire fleet obsolete. He just couldn't compete with the new free traders and Yankees.
So what did he do? This forced him to make a decisive and modern pivot.
It did. Instead of fighting the outdated technology and the new competition, he transformed his capital. He sold his ships, which must have been a painful decision, representing the end of an era, and he diversified his enormous fortune into modern financial instruments.
Like what?
He invested heavily in insurance companies, railway companies, and joint stock banks. He didn't just survive, he became a major player in the modern domain of finance, showcasing an adaptability that defined the truly modern capitalist.
Now let's move from commerce to civic life, because Jamsetji's use of wealth was perhaps his most lasting legacy. He didn't just give money away, he institutionalized philanthropy.
Reflecting a new concept of public responsibilities, as the sources put it, his generosity began early and personally. In 1822, his first public act was paying the debts of several prisoners in Bombay jails to ensure their release.
But the scale grew dramatically.
It did. And he used his immense wealth to address social needs across all communities, deliberately focusing on non-Parsi beneficiaries as well. He earned praise from the government for the peculiar feature of liberality in contemplating the benefit of classes different from his own.
And the structure of his giving was revolutionary, too. It reflected the same business acumen he used in his trading ventures.
It absolutely did. His major foundations, most famously the Jamsetji Jijipoi Hospital and the School of Art, were organized with a managerially sound structure. Crucially, he used the colonial government as the executor of the trust fund
Why did he do that?
to prevent misappropriation, a problem he had seen plague traditional, often poorly managed charities.
So he essentially created a civic endowment. That's incredibly modern.
Precisely. He insisted that the principal sum, the core capital, be permanently secured in the government treasury, with only the interest being paid out annually for the running of the institution. This ensured the long-term sustainability and accountability of the public good.
It cemented his legacy not just as a wealthy man, but as a modern institution builder.
It did, and this level of public service and alignment with modern British values earned him unparalleled recognition. He was knighted in 1842.
An honor that highlighted his unique contribution.
It did. Lord Elphinstone, speaking at the time, rhetorically asked if any other city in the entire world could boast of a citizen who had devoted £250,000 to purposes of public charity and benevolence.
So Jamsetji successfully leveraged the colonial economic system and then, through disciplined business practice and institutionalized giving, transformed himself into a global figure.
A truly remarkable story.
Okay, so if Jamsetji was the meticulous global trader and institution builder, our third figure, Premchen Roychen, represents the spectacular volatility of the era. He was the epitome of risk and speculation.
Whose breathtaking rise ended in a defining catastrophic crash.
Yes.
Tell us about him. Premchen Roychen, an Oswald Jain, was defined by his expansive temperament and grit. His trajectory perfectly encapsulates the frenetic, speculative pace of capital formation that swept Bombay in the mid-19th century. And unlike Trowadi and Jamsetji, Premchen benefited immensely from a formal Western education.
That was key, wasn't it?
It was. His father, Dingap Chand, ensured Premchen received an English education at pioneering institutions like the Elphinstone Native Education Institution.
And this proficiency in English and exposure to Western commercial ideas allowed him to easily forge critical contacts with the influential European business community and officialdom,
giving him an immediate advantage over more traditional Gujarati merchants. He used those contacts and that education to start small, building his reputation on trust before hitting the big leagues.
He began as a guarantee broker.
Right, essentially providing credibility and vouching for other Indian businessmen dealing with European firms. And by effectively buying and selling hundas and stocks, he quickly amassed a significant early fortune. But that was just the appetizer.
And then came the enormous external shock that created the most insane interlude in Bombay's economic history: the American Civil War.
Lincoln's abolition of slavery in the southern United States abruptly cut off the supply of slave-picked cotton to the mills of Lancashire.
And Premchen instantly recognized this vacuum as a lifetime opportunity.
He moved with incredible speed, encouraging Gujarat farmers to switch immediately to planting the required long-staple cotton variety needed by the English mills.
And this created an economic frenzy where cotton became the supreme deity.
Cotton prices skyrocketed overnight. A colossal amount of capital, British, Indian, foreign, flooded into Bombay. The sources vividly describe how King Cotton was the great deity, worshipped by everyone.
Speculation in cotton futures became rampant.
Completely rampant. The demand for raw cotton was so high that merchants went to extraordinary lengths. The sources note that even beddings were ransacked to collect raw cotton scraps that could be shipped to the desperate English market.
With all this surplus wealth accumulating, what was the logical next step for investment in Bombay?
Land reclamation. Bombay was an island with limited physical space. Governor Sir Bartle Frere actively supported these private-public ventures, like the famous Back Bay Reclamation Company, to create more real estate by filling in the sea.
And Frere was convinced that private companies would work better and quicker than public ones.
He was. And Premchen Roychen became the king of cotton and the mastermind financing these massive, often speculative reclamation programs.
And this is where the story shifts from entrepreneurial dynamism to the dangers of unchecked cronyism. Premchen was able to manipulate the very heart of the city's financial system.
He was appointed a director of the Bank of Bombay, the city's primary financial institution, during Frere's governorship, and he immediately exploited the bank's lax banking practices and his extremely cozy relationship with key officials, most notably Secretary Blair.
He essentially became the operational power broker of the bank.
He did, using its capital to fuel his own ventures.
What exactly was his deceptive modus operandi?
It was a classic insider scheme. He didn't just take out loans in his own name. He financed his own massive speculative ventures by procuring loans and advances in the names of his friends, his associates, even his domestic servants.
So he was using the bank's money to purchase shares in the very reclamation schemes he was promoting.
And rigging the market directly.
Yes.
The subsequent inquiry commission provided clear evidence of this manipulation. For instance, the shares of the Eastern Financial Company were on the verge of bankruptcy, but Premchand intervened, managing to sell them at a 40% premium
How?
by using Bank of Bombay money to prop up the price. This influence permeated the entire system.
So he was, in effect, running a complex financial shell game, using the city's own central bank as his personal ATM.
That's a very good way to put it. But as we know, the bubble was guaranteed to burst.
The end came in 1865.
When the external shock reversed itself, the American Civil War ended, American cotton supplies resumed flooding the global market, and prices plummeted overnight. Overdue bills and loans piled up, and when the settlement day for time bargains arrived,
Massive insolvency gripped the city.
total collapse. The Bank of Bombay shares, which had been trading at nearly a 200% premium just 6 months prior, fell below par. The crash ruined dozens of families, commercial houses, and institutions that had trusted Premchand or invested in his schemes.
It was a failure of regulatory oversight as much as a failure of capital.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources show this crash led to widespread economic distress and a total loss of confidence in the city's financial leadership.
But given the scale of the destruction he wrought, what's fascinating is the resilience of his personal reputation. How is he able to pay off his debts and maintain his commercial standing?
This speaks volumes about the lingering power of the traditional Banya ethos, even in this hyper-modern, volatile environment. Despite the Bank of Bombay failure being directly attributed to his operations, Premchand prioritized clearing his personal obligations.
A man's word, his personal abru was still critical.
It was still paramount. By diligently paying off his personal debts, he maintained commercial credibility. It demonstrated that the traditional value system could still survive the catastrophic failure of modern speculative capitalism.
And his commitment to civic life continued, tying his vision for the city directly to the wealth he had so controversially generated.
His philanthropic activities never ceased. He supported progress through education, endowing the universities of Bombay and Calcutta, supporting schools for girl children, a very progressive vision for the time.
His civic ambition was tied to property and beautification.
Very much so. That architectural centerpiece of Bombay, Elphinstone Circle, was built entirely on the speculation money of the 1860s. So he, like Trewady, maintained a dual allegiance, aligning with modern needs while drawing strength from the traditional requirement of maintaining one's honor.
Okay, let's bring it all together. If we synthesize the careers of these three phenomenal merchant princes, we see three distinct, brilliant adaptations to this sweeping political and economic transition.
We really do. You have Trewady Arjunji Nachi, who showed how to leverage political fluidity. He used his pre-existing financial network and traditional social capital, his abru, to make himself indispensable to the emerging English power.
Ensuring his traditional power structure remained relevant even in a new world.
Then you have Jamsetji Jajibhoy, who, on the other hand, fully embraced the new global free trade system. He exemplified modern commercial values, diligence, diversification, technological adaptability.
And he channeled his immense wealth into sustainable, institutionalized public good, aligning himself with the progressive legal framework of the colonial state.
Exactly. And finally, Premchand Roychand is the cautionary tale. He demonstrated how explosive private capital could form almost instantaneously by exploiting volatile commodity markets and very lax regulatory environments.
His manipulation of the Bank of Bombay vividly illustrates the immense danger of crony capitalism.
When private financial interests become dangerously intermingled with state-supported institutions, yes.
So what are the key lessons that emerge from all this?
The sources really reaffirm the organic, self-reinforcing relationship between trade, cities, and good governance. Specifically, that non-negotiable millet for the rule of law that Angier mandated centuries earlier.
And the knowledge here is immensely practical for modern business.
It is. We see the potential of free trade. The breaking of the company's monopoly led to an explosion in enterprise. But we also see that private capital, when left entirely unchecked, runs the grave danger of self-destruction and systemic failure.
As the Bank of Bombay collapse proves so vividly.
It does.
This entire narrative is filled with the true romance of commerce. The risk, the daring, the high-stakes adventure. And it's important to note that the ultimate key to their success was their willingness to operate in what the sources call interstitial spaces.
Leveraging traditional indigenous networks of credit and trust while simultaneously embracing and manipulating Western mechanisms, whether it was the mayor's court or institutionalized trust funds.
And their success, while leading to spectacular personal wealth for a few, was demonstrably not a zero-sum game.
No, the rapid, unrelenting growth of Bombay and the rise of other new cities created employment and opportunities for the landless masses. It fueled migration and urbanization on an unprecedented scale, transforming the entire subcontinent's economic potential.
It's a powerful lesson in entrepreneurial agility and the creation of economic infrastructure. But here is the final provocative thought for you to consider, based on the choices these three men made.
While the foundational success of all three relied on their personal integrity and network of trust, that's sacred to brew, the biggest risk they ultimately took was choosing how to engage with the dominant global political and economic order.
Girardi chose to reinforce the traditional system through colonial patronage. Jamsetji and Premchand chose to fully embrace and often exploit the colonial system's mechanisms.
So what remains for you to consider is this. Can a modern business truly thrive today by successfully straddling those two worlds, the traditional world of personal trust networks and the globalized modern system of impersonal institutions? Or is full, singular alignment with a dominant, standardized global financial system the ultimate prerequisite for sustainable, world-changing capital formation?